So this is chapter 9, racial and ethnic differentiation. So throughout this chapter, we're going to discuss the differences between terms like race, ethnicity, minority groups. We'll take a look at race relations. So here we'll be discussing segregation and assimilation, cultural pluralism. We'll talk about some issues of ethnic conflict like stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, genocide. And then from there, we'll take a look at some of the major U.S. ethnic groups. And so we'll take a look at the historical elements that are out there. So let's first distinguish between these three terms. Your racial group is a biological category that is characterized by your skin color, how much melanin you have in your skin. It's a biological characteristic. White or Caucasian, Black, Asian, Native American, Hispanic. So it's going to deal more with the biological aspect of your skin color. We have people of different races all over the world. It's not really going to signify their nationality or their language or any of those cultural elements. It's just your race. We have Asians that live in Ireland, and they are Irish. We have white people that live on the continent of Africa, and they are African. We have white people that live in Mexico, and they are Mexican. All right? So there's a difference between race and ethnicity. Your ethnicity is going to be the cultural aspect of who you are as an individual, not so much your skin color. Your nationality, the nation that you're born and raised in, the language that you speak, the food you eat. Okay? So it's going to kind of tie in more to those cultural elements. And it's usually much more nationally specific, like if you're German or Irish or English or American or Honduran or Belizean, Afghanistan, if you're Afghanistani. So it's going to really signify much more of the country that you're living in, the language that you speak. Minority groups. A lot of times whenever people think of minority groups, they think about the smallest group of people. Sociology doesn't look at it that way. Sociology looks at a minority group not based on size, but based on power and privilege and opportunity. So a minority group is going to be a group of people who have less power, less privilege, less opportunity than other groups. They may experience racism, segregation, discrimination, sexism. So, for example, if we talked about the various social classes, the upper class, the middle, the working, and the lower. Do you remember which one of those social classes is the smallest? What's that? The upper class. The upper class is the smallest, but it is the most powerful. It has the most power and privilege, right? So even though it's the smallest, it is the most powerful. So that's an example of how the smallest group is not a minority group. The upper class is not a minority group, sociologically speaking, because they have a lot of resources, a lot of power. Another example would be women compared to males. Women outnumber males, but females are considered a minority group in the United States because of some of the issues that they may experience that a lot of men don't experience. Sexism, employment discrimination, sexual assault, sex trafficking, other forms of discrimination. So this is not about group size. This has to do with how certain groups of people are being treated in society. So those are the difference between race, ethnicity, and minority. Let's take a look at some ethnic relations. Segregation. This is the process of separating people in society. Here in the United States, we kind of historically separated people primarily due to their race. Process of separating people in society. Integration is allowing people to come together, to be part of mainstream society, to kind of come together, to live next to each other, to work around each other, get married to each other. They're part of mainstream society. They've kind of come together. They go to school together. They sit on the bus next to each other. Different races, different ethnicities allowed to come together. They're not separated. They're allowed to come together. Assimilation. So A for absorption. So this is the process of an ethnic group being absorbed into the dominant culture within that society. And through the process of being absorbed into that culture, they lose part of their own cultural elements through the process. A good example of this would be immigrants who come into the United States and they become Americanized. Coming to the United States, if they are absorbed into the American culture, taking on the values of democracy and capitalism and Christianity, learning English, becoming a naturalized citizen, they are becoming absorbed into the American culture. And at the same time, they're losing part of their own cultural elements because they're being absorbed into the dominant culture. We saw this through Ellis Island. This is referred to as Anglo-conformity assimilation, being absorbed into American society. This can be voluntarily or involuntarily. A lot of people who come through Ellis Island, who come to the United States, they came over voluntarily. But we do have certain groups that did not come over here voluntarily. For example, who would those be? The African slaves did not voluntarily come over to the United States, but they are still a byproduct of being Americanized. So not all immigration into the U.S. has been voluntary. Most have, but not all. Next, we have cultural pluralism. So this is the process of trying to avoid being assimilated to the dominant culture. You may live within a dominant culture, but you're trying to hold on to your cultural distinctiveness, your uniqueness. You may be part of the grander part of mainstream society. It's very important for you to kind of hold on to your cultural distinctiveness. We have had immigrants come into the United States and decide to not become American citizens. They want to work here and send the money back home. They want to kind of hold on to their uniqueness. And this is why in New York City, there are so many different neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods. You know, it's allowed a lot of immigrants who've come into the U.S. to kind of hold on to a part of who they are. Native Americans who have decided to stay on the reservations, hold on to their religion, their culture, their language, their uniqueness, and not being absorbed and becoming Americanized. That's another example of cultural pluralism. Now let's kind of move in to take a look at ethnic conflict. So you can see here there's several different definitions and terms we're going to have to distinguish between. The first one is going to be stereotypes. Stereotype is going to be a broad generalized belief that a certain category of people have certain types of characteristics, that they're all that way. A lot of time it does lead into racism, prejudice, and discrimination. All Asians are smart. All Jewish people are greedy. Elderly people can't drive. I mean, anytime you can take an entire group of people and give a particular characteristic or category to them, this is going to be referred to as a stereotype. Prejudice, to prejudge. This is having a negative attitude towards a certain group of people. It's a negative perception, it's a negative attitude. And it may be based on race, but it could be based on ethnicity, religion, social class, nationality, sexual orientation, looks. It can be based on anything. People are prejudiced for all different types of reasons. If you take a look at this photograph right here, it says, Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. I'm not sure, have I shown y'all this photograph before? So if you take a look at this historically, Japs, that's a derogatory term for Japanese Americans. But historically, you should be able to place this during a certain time in American history. What's that?
Pearl Harbor.
Before or after Pearl Harbor?
It's probably after.
After Pearl Harbor, that's right. So this was definitely after Pearl Harbor, for sure. But this was during World War II. And this is where we saw a lot of prejudice and discrimination against Japanese Americans, even if they were American citizens. We'll talk a little bit later about the time where they were put in internment camps, even here in the state of Arkansas. Discrimination. Discrimination is an action, it's a verb. This is the process of excluding people from certain rights and opportunities. Not allowing women to vote prior to 1920. Not allowing homosexuals into the American military back in the 80s and before. Anytime you're excluding people from certain rights and opportunities, this is called discrimination. Racism. This is going to be the perception that one's race is superior to others. Once you have this perception that one's race is superior to others, it can definitely lead to prejudice and discrimination and to violence, and sometimes it'll even move into what's called racial profiling. And racial profiling is the idea that certain groups of people, certain races or ethnic groups of people, are more likely to commit crimes, and so they are profiled or monitored more closely than others. If you have a young African American male who's driving a very nice car, a luxury car, and they're being pulled over simply for the fact they're African American driving that car, then they've been profiled. If you have Arab Americans in airports being screened more closely because they are Muslim, it's going to be another example of profiling. Other ethnic conflicts, we have mass expulsion. This is the process of pushing people off of their land. They're being massively expelled. Just like if a student gets expelled from school, he has to leave. This is on a massive level. This is also referred to as ethnic cleansing, being pushed off of their land. We saw this among Native Americans, being pushed off their land onto reservations. We also saw this when it comes to slavery in the United States, chattel slavery, which chattel slavery means property slavery. If you take a certain ethnic group from one continent and you massively expel them onto another continent, this is referred to as mass expulsion. So that's another example there. Genocide. This is the process of trying to intentionally exterminate or kill off an entire group of people. There's a lot of historical examples here. During World War II, we have the Holocaust of the Jews. Native Americans have experienced genocide, and numbers dwindled from tens of millions to about 250,000 by 1850. A lot of this was due to not only just wars, but also smallpox and other types of European communicable diseases that were purposely given to them. I don't know if y'all have ever seen a disturbing movie called Hotel Rwanda. It's a very difficult movie to watch. I've watched it only one time, and it talks about the genocide that happened in Rwanda in the 1990s between two ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. And there was about 1 million women, men, and children that were slaughtered within a 100-day period. These two ethnic groups were trying to slaughter each other out. Darfur, it's talked about quite a bit when it comes to genocide. That's an area on the continent of Africa and Sudan. And a lot of times mass expulsion and genocide, they go together. So mass expulsion sometimes is about pushing people off their land, and sometimes through that process, there's a lot of conflict and people are being killed. We saw this among the Native Americans. So any questions before we move into take a look at some U.S. ethnic groups? All right. Native Americans. A lot of diversity here. There's over 500 recognized tribes. The largest among them are the Cherokee. I mentioned earlier about the genocide, where whenever the first European settlers came here, there were tens of millions of Native Americans. And by 1850, their numbers have went down to about 250,000. Mass expulsion is the process of pushing Native Americans off their land. This was done by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. This was called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Native Americans, primarily the Cherokee, were moved from the east side of the Mississippi River to the west side of the Mississippi River up into the Oklahoma territories, even passing through here in central Arkansas. Sometimes you will see signs if you drive around Conway, they'll say Trail of Tears. They were migrated through this area, and this created the Trail of Tears. So they were massively expelled. A few different reasons. One had to do with the connection of the Transcontinental Railroad by moving them off that land into certain geographic reservations to allow the United States to work on that Transcontinental Railroad. But there was also gold found in the foothills of Georgia, and so those resources were heavily desired by American citizens. And so by pushing them off that land, we're able to excavate that gold more easily. In 1924, President Calvin Coolidge gave Native Americans their citizenship. Decades after African Americans, decades. And if you take a look at this photograph, this is at the White House lawn. That is President Coolidge with various representatives of various Native American tribes. They were given their citizenship in 1924. The reason they were given their citizenship is because they aided the United States in helping us win World War I during the 19-teens. They acted as decoders for the United States. So out of that loyalty, they were given their citizenship about a decade later. World War I was in the 19-teens. In 1924, they were given their citizenship. So I'm sure you are aware of that. Now we have white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, also known as the WASP. These were the earliest white European settlers into the United States before the United States became the United States. The earliest colonial. They are considered the dominant ethnic group in the United States. The reason they are referred to as the dominant ethnic group is because they brought a lot of the American values and characteristics that we still know of today. Capitalism, the for-profit economic system we use, was created by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Whenever we broke away from England during the American Revolution, formed a new constitution, this was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They also instituted slavery as well, which helped build the United States over several hundred years to the powerhouse that it is. They brought Christianity to the U.S. They brought the English language to the United States. And so pretty much every other ethnic group that has come to the U.S. after them, they have been absorbed or become Americanized through the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's referred to as assimilating up. You're being absorbed up. That's why they refer to this as Anglo-conformity assimilation, because of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That's why they call it Anglo-conformity. They're conforming to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Next, we have white ethnics. So these are going to be the white Europeans that came after the United States had already been developed. They came by ships up through Ellis Island. So there are differences between various Caucasian ethnic groups. These are not the earliest white European immigrants. They came a couple hundred years later. They are referred to white ethnics. They came in the 19th and 20th century. You have the Industrial Revolution, which really kind of allowed the United States to really be booming. And that was a huge drive. It was a magnetic drive of immigration into the United States. After the Civil War, up into World War I, that time period, there were millions and millions of European immigrants flooding into the United States because of the Industrial Revolution. It was referred to as the Great Migration. At the end of the Civil War, the 1860s, up until the 19-teens, tens of millions of white Europeans were coming to the U.S. in major ports like Ellis Island, and also a major port in California. But it had to be slowed down. By 1924, President Calvin Coolidge put in place the Immigration Act of 1924. This significantly slowed down immigration because we had so many people coming in for 60 or 70 years, it really started to slow it down. So it reduced immigration in the U.S., and this is by Calvin Coolidge, which kind of makes sense because by 1924, there wasn't a really strong need for immigrants to come into the U.S. The Transcontinental Railroad had already been completed at that point. The gold rush was over at that point. And so there were so many people coming in, they just had to kind of just start backing off a little bit and screening people a little bit more closely. Jewish Americans is another ethnic group here in the U.S. It's one of the most predominant religious ethnic groups. The heaviest concentration of Jewish Americans are in New York City. They are included as those white ethnics that were coming into Ellis Island on those ships. So the heaviest concentration is in New York City. They've experienced what's known as anti-Semitism, not just in the U.S., but globally around the world. Anti-Semitism is the prejudice and discrimination against Jews. So if we're talking about the Holocaust of World War II, the skinheads of Europe, the skinheads of the United States, the Ku Klux Klan, which was created after the Civil War, these are all examples of anti-Semitism. Very resilient ethnic group, successful academically, economically, despite high levels of oppression. And over the last couple of years, unfortunately, we have seen a rise in hate crimes towards Jewish Americans. If we're looking at specifically the category of hate crimes, just from a religious perspective, Jewish Americans have the highest issues of hate crimes here in the U.S. Latino Americans. This is the largest ethnic group in the U.S., the largest ethnic minority group. We have about 60 million. They surpassed African Americans in the 1990s. So at one point during the 90s, African Americans were the largest ethnic minority group. Now African Americans are the second largest ethnic minority group. Most Latinos come from Mexico, but you also have Latinos that come from various countries around the world, Puerto Rico, Cuba, various Central and South American countries, even Spain. They tend to be traditionally Catholic, but there is a lot of religious diversity. But for the most part, a lot of Latinos are Catholic. They tend to value larger families. So when it comes to birth rates, they tend to have more children, especially compared to whites. And it's also been increasing bilingualism in the U.S. The majority of Latino Americans are American citizens. They're coming of age in regards to voting. And so this is a huge political bloc that both Republicans and Democrats are looking at very closely, because Latinos, like I said, are the largest ethnic minority group in the country, and they are voters. So this is something politically that both sides are taking a hard look at. Another reason why they are the largest ethnic minority group in the U.S. is because of the Mexican-American War. It's only lasted for 2 years. Lasted from 1846 to 1848. During this time, the United States was at war with Mexico. After this war, the United States was able to take possession of this massive territory from Texas all the way to California. In 1846 and prior, this was Mexican territory. And so another reason why our Latino population has increased is due to this war. We took this territory that was predominantly, it was owned from Mexico, and it became part of the United States. A massive territory. Texas, Utah, California. Texas and California alone are massive. New Mexico, Arizona, this entire area right here. Yes, Colorado, yep. It's a massive area. That leads us into the second largest ethnic minority group, African Americans. So as you can see here, a lot of historical events. It's broken down into two major social movements. The abolitionist movement, which is their main objective was to end slavery. Civil rights movement, their main objective was to end segregation. So let's take first a look at the abolitionist movement, which started prior to the Civil War. We had the Dred Scott decision, 1857. This is a few years prior to the Civil War. This is where slavery still existed here in the U.S. This is where a slave tried to sue for their freedom, Dred Scott. It was rejected because slaves were not considered U.S. citizens. And since they were not U.S. citizens, and they were considered property, they were not allowed to sue for their freedom. This was about a 10-year court battle. During the Civil War, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, which was signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. This was a declaration from his administration that the Southern slaves were free. Now, just because this was a proclamation or a declaration doesn't mean that that's whenever slavery ended. That had to go through Congress. So it took 2 more years to formally abolish slavery in the country. This is called the 13th Amendment. It had to be voted on through Congress. A couple of years later, this is where African Americans received their citizenship. This is the 14th Amendment. It stated that those people that were born in the United States, if you were born on this soil, you are American citizens. That included those slaves that were born here in the U.S. So the 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship, which in turn pretty much repealed the Dred Scott decision. A couple of years later, we have the 15th Amendment. This gave African American males the right to vote. A stark difference from whenever Native Americans were given their citizenship, 1924. African Americans were given their citizenship in 1868. And then we have those Jim Crow laws. This was after the Civil War. And this is where that they allowed the states to decide whether or not the state wanted to be a segregated state or not. Slavery had been abolished at this point in 1865. So the majority of the southern states, they took on those Jim Crow laws. And in all public areas, they would segregate blacks and whites. Blacks and whites went to different schools. They went to different restrooms. They sat in different areas of the bus or the restaurant. These are those Jim Crow laws. It instituted segregation publicly throughout the state. Now we're moving into the 1900s, the mid-1900s. So now we have the civil rights movement. Like I stated earlier, the main objective was to end segregation. So let's take a look at some of these historical events. The first thing we have is the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This was anti-miscegenation laws, and I know that's a big word. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited interracial marriage. It was called the Racial Integrity Act. Prohibited whites and non-whites from getting married to each other. We're moving into the civil rights movement. We have iconic figures like Rosa Parks, who's the mother of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and also famous sociologist who we talked about, W.B. Du Bois, who started the NAACP. So that kind of moves us into 1954. We have Brown versus the Board of Education, and this is really one of the first segments to really start dismantling segregation, and it took it out of our school systems. So this is whenever they started to desegregate schools. And here in Arkansas, we have the Little Rock 9 Central High School in Little Rock. That's whenever they started to desegregate that school. A very tumultuous time down here in the South. Just because segregation was starting to slowly be eradicated, there was an incredible amount of pushback there. So that was in 1954. A decade later, in 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. This formally abolished segregation in all public areas. So what this did, this repealed those Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws allowed segregation. Nearly 100 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, who was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, got rid of segregation in all public areas. Lyndon B. Johnson also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which expanded the rights of African Americans in regards to voting. There was a lot of barriers put in place to try to prevent African Americans from voting, and so the voting rights kind of expanded and made it easier for African Americans to vote. Lastly, in 1967, we have a very famous court case called Loving versus Virginia. And Loving versus Virginia got rid of all anti-miscegenation laws. Anti-miscegenation laws were laws that prohibited interracial marriage. Loving versus Virginia did away with that, essentially repealing the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. So the Loving was the Loving couple. They made a movie about it. They've got documentaries about it. You had Mildred Loving. They were both from Virginia. They got married in the 1950s. They didn't get married in Virginia because they were of different races. So what they did is they went up north and got married, and they came back to Virginia, not realizing that they had just committed a felony, and they were arrested for that. So we have Mildred Loving, who was half black, half Native American, and her husband, Richard Loving, which was a white male from Virginia. Poor people, not very educated at all. So they sued the state of Virginia, and due to the Racial Integrity Act, they lost. They decided to take their case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. There were a couple of young lawyers up in New York City that took their case pro bono. They were civil rights attorneys, pro bono meaning for free. There's no way they could have paid them at all. And so this was also another 10-year battle. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1967, they won because of that. After they won, you had many southern states that now had to allow interracial marriage. If you take a look at this photograph, this picture of the United States here, all this area in red prior to 1967 did not allow interracial marriage at all. A lot of the northern states did, and this is very, very typical of what happens whenever trends start to change in the United States. This map looked very similar in 2015 whenever same-sex marriage was legalized through the U.S. Supreme Court. And the reason this is important, a lot of times when we think about famous historical people that have changed, we don't hear a lot of times about the uneducated and the poor that came together to kind of push back. There's a lot of people that have never heard of Mildred Loving, Richard Loving, or this famous court case, but because of them, interracial marriage is allowed nationwide. Do you have any comments or questions so far? Next, we have Asian Americans. It's the third largest ethnic minority group, but it's also the fastest growing. The majority of Asian Americans do come from China. Chinese men, this was a major form of immigration coming into the U.S. in the 1800s to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, the gold rush in California, but also in the coal mines as well. So if we take a look at the various Asian American ethnic groups, Chinese Americans are going to be the largest. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place. And what this did, it pretty much essentially kind of sealed the borders. It didn't allow any more Chinese immigration to come into the United States. Those Chinese Americans that were still here, that were living here, they were not deported, they were able to stay. But because there was no longer really a need for cheap labor, the Transcontinental Railroad had already been completed at that point. the purpose of this was to really kind of pull the brakes on Chinese immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. And I do want you to know why. The main reason was because we had a lot of Chinese Americans helping us, signing up to win World War II during this time, to fight against Japan, Italy, and Germany. So due to their loyalty of helping us win World War II, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what's interesting is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though he got rid of the Chinese Exclusionary Act, he pretty much turned around pretty quickly and put in another form of exclusionary policy known as Executive Order 9066. So Executive Order 9066, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it rounded up Japanese Americans and it strategically put them in various internment camps, or also referred to as war relocation camps. Utah, Arizona, California, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and even our state of Arkansas. Decades later, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And this gave reparations money to those individuals that were put in those internment camps. They gave $25,000, and in exchange for accepting the $25,000, this is not something that's really talked about, but if you pull up the Civil Liberties Act and actually read it, it's an agreement that we as the United States are going to give you $25,000 for taking your civil liberties away from you, but you can no longer hold the United States responsible for what we did. That's typically not talked about politically. Whenever Ronald Reagan was talking about the reparations from a political standpoint, he said, this is something that's owed, this is a stain on our country. But the one thing he did not talk about was that those people would never be able to hold the United States responsible if they took that money. A lot of times things are contractual.